16th century Europe was experiencing an age of social, intellectual, and religious unrest. This period really transforms European culture. During this time, they experienced continuous warfare due to expansionist ambitions of various rulers. Now, in the 14th and 15th century, they were really rooted in the medieval period. And yes, they started reading the classical texts, but they were really uncritical of them. In the 16th century, people start to not just read these classical texts of Roman and Greek scholars, but they also analyze them and they improve upon them. They examine new ideas about nature and lands, and also new things that are going on in the 16th century, of course, is that the Americas are opened up. Remember, at the very end of the 15th century, in 1492, Christopher Columbus arrives in America. Also during the late 15th century, we have the printing press, which was invented by, or at least made popular by Johann Gutenberg. And that was about 1440. This really takes off in the Renaissance. And yeah, it was invented in the 15th century, but it really takes off in the Renaissance. And this is a great time where they're able to produce more texts, and these spread more ideas. Travel is also more common during this time. Artists and their work are both more mobile. This makes artistic styles less regional. We've been looking at a lot of regional styles, particularly when we were looking at like the Italo-Byzantine style. It was a very regional Italian style. But now styles can become a little bit more international. In the beginning of the 16th century, England, France, and Portugal are all nations under strong monarchs. In Central Europe, the situation is that we had this in this German region. We have dozens of cities or territories, but they are under the lordship of the Habsburgs. So they're not really Germany yet. They do lay the foundations of what will be known as Germany later. The Habsburgs are a very powerful family. They will influence much of Europe for a very long time. Charles V is a Habsburg, and he will become the Holy Roman Emperor. And he will control the German region, Spain, Netherlands, and parts of the Americas. So that's what's going on in Europe as a whole. In Italy at this time in the 16th century is separated into many small states or city-states. They are fighting each other, and they're also fighting the Habsburgs. They're also fighting Spain, France, and the papacy. So they're pretty busy with this whole fighting thing. During this time, during the Renaissance, the popes become secular princes, and they become very, very rich. There's actually a really good book that talks about the popes during this time, and it's called The Bad Popes, and it's by Russell Chamberlain. So if you're interested in that, it's a really interesting book, and it shows you about sort of the pope's role during the Renaissance. So during this time, the popes are going to use diplomacy and military force to regain control over central Italy. The popes also increase their demands for money so that they can rebuild St. Peter's and also support their sort of self-promoting art projects. And they did have, they're sort of called these princes during this time because they have this very luxurious lifestyle. This leads to more religious dissent. You know, they're supposed to be this religious figures, but instead they are spending a lot of money promoting themselves, not just the role as pope. And in the early 16th century, church beliefs and practices are challenged. One of the things that people really had a problem with was the sale of indulgences. An indulgence is a financial contribution for the forgiveness of sins and insurance of salvation. So it's kind of similar to that practice when we talked about Giotto and we talked about the Arena Chapel and how Enrico Scornavagni commissioned this chapel to be built, and basically he's commissioning it and spending lots of money on it to sort of buy his way and his father's way into heaven. Well, it's kind of the same principle behind these indulgences. So finally, in Northern Europe, in the Holy Roman Empire in 1517, Martin Luther nails 95 theses up on the church door. and this begins the Protestant Reformation. It's called they actually end up being called the Protestants because they are protesting. So he's calling for church reform, and this is going to drive the Catholics to respond with their own fight against Protestants, and also eventually internal reform and renewal. This will be known as the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation will have profound effects on art, and we'll talk about that in a later lecture. So Pope Clement II, who was Pope from, the 7th, who was Pope from 1523 to 1534, he clashes with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And in 1527, Charles and his German mercenaries sack Rome. And basically, Rome experiences 6 months of killing, looting, and burning, among other things. This shook the stability and the humanistic confidence of Rome. Rome very much becomes kind of the capital of this high Renaissance, and it's sort of like Rome is being reborn and supported by these Pope princes, but now they've been sacked by the Holy Roman Emperor. So finally in 1530, Clement and Charles make peace, and Clement crowns Charles the Holy Roman Emperor in Bologna. Now in the 16th century, patrons valued artists fairly highly. They got generous commissions, and some artists had a high social status. Some artists achieved international fame. Now during this time, most artists are still men. Female artists were denied studio practice that was necessary for them to draw nude figures. So remember, they're looking back at these Greek and Roman statues, and of course, especially during the Greek period, the classical Greek period, we have a lot of nude statues. Well, one of the ways that you learn how to draw figures is, of course, you study a live model. So women, it was not proper for women to be in the same studio and be drawing a nude man during this time. So that kind of really limits, their training. Also, to be a famous artist during this period, you're going to have to travel a lot. And also to make a lot of money, you're going to have to travel, relocate for commissions. Women, of course, couldn't do this. Their place is, during this time, in the home. But at the same time, there are some female artists, and we'll continue to see some more as we kind of keep going down the timeline here. In Italy, from the 1490s to 1527, which is that sack of Rome, this is known as the High Renaissance, or this classical phase. It's characterized by a sense of gravity, complex but balanced relationships between individual parts to the whole, deeper understanding of humanism, and ancient classical art than in the 15th century. There were two important developments at the turn of the 16th century. One was the use of tempera paint gave way to the use of oil paint, and two, commissions from private sources increased. So artists are no longer depending solely on the patronage of the church or the aristocracy or the civic associations. Some middle-class people were able to gain enough wealth that they could collect classical antiques, contemporary paintings, things like that. The early 16th century was dominated by three artists, and I'm sure you have heard of these three artists. It is Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. All three of these artists began careers in Florence, but they moved to the centers, they moved to other centers, and their influence spread far beyond Florence. The frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel really inspired these and other artists. So if you remember back to like Masaccio's tribute money, the solid figures that Masaccio was painting, these solid monumental figures, and also eloquent facial features, poses, and gestures, if you remember back to that Adam and Eve images that he created, those were very influential on these artists and Renaissance artists.